Today we're getting into chapter 2, which focuses in on logic. When it comes to chapter 2, you are going to notice a number of differences from what we did in chapter 1. In fact, the beginning of chapter 2 is going to feel a bit like an English class. And it has to do with the fact that chapter 2 focuses on this idea of using logic, using sound reasoning to go through eventually mathematical problems. But before we get to the actual using that logic to do math, we need to make sure we are solid on that logic itself. So that's why the beginning of this chapter is going to feel a little bit weird. Another thing that's going to come up in this chapter is known as proofs. Now, if you've never heard of a proof before, a proof is essentially where I give you some information and I tell you to legitimately prove insert piece of information here. And in order to do a proof, you have to go through step by step showing me all of your work and how you get from point A to eventually to point B. And the main reason we do this is, as I said, it's about using logic. It's about making sound arguments. There's a new notes packet up here, by the way, Landon. So, one thing I would ask, please make sure that your name is on your notes packet. That way, if it gets left in here, I know who to give it back to. And we're starting up on the first page of notes, which is actually page 3. That's not your seat.
I'll be as good as I solemnly swear I'll be super good.
Today, it's going to be a daily basis thing. To make that decision. Okay. So today and tomorrow we're going to be working through section 2.1, focusing on this idea of what's known as a conditional statement. A conditional statement is really a logical statement, aka a really kind of a sentence, that's written in an if, them, then form. And y'all have heard many of conditional statements probably in your life. If you behave appropriately, then I will let you continue to sit in that spot type of thing. It's a great example. If you do well on your test, then you will be allowed to insert item here. You get used a lot by parents. So, when it comes to working with a conditional statement, the if piece, that is really, it's the condition. It's also known as the hypothesis. It's the thing that we're saying, in theory, this is true. In theory, we're going to actually meet that if. And if we meet that if, then the then piece is called the conclusion. Now, one of the important things that we get in this class is we have to be able to recognize what is hypothesis and what is conclusion, even if the if-then statement isn't written in a traditional if-then format. So, to just get some pure recognition, we're going to practice doing a little bit of underlining the hypothesis and boxing in of the conclusion. And I'm just doing that in the instructions just to kind of help us keep clear which one's which. If yesterday was Wednesday, then today is Thursday. The hypothesis is the if part, so everything that follows the word if. Technically, the if isn't part of the hypothesis. It's the setup. Everything following if, up until the then, is the hypothesis. So, hypothesis was yesterday was Wednesday. Then, today is Thursday. The then is not a part of either of them. The stuff following the then is the conclusion. And that's if it's written in its true, pure form. Not all of them are going to be written in that form. And that's where we really tend to need a little bit more practice. Then A, B, C lie on the same line if they are collinear. Which part is the hypothesis? They are collinear. The conclusion? Points A, B, and C lie on the same line. X is equal to 5 if 2x minus 7 is equal to 3. I can make these a lot more mathy. I can make them equation-like. The hypothesis would be 2x minus 7 is equal to 3. That's the part that follows the if. Do you see the word then in here?
Nope.
No.
But all we can do is assume that x equals 5 is the conclusion.
This is the conclusion because I could just as easily say if 2x minus 7 is equal to 3, then x is equal to 5. If it's still a logical statement by putting the then in there and it doesn't change the meaning, you can assume that it's then. An angle is referred to as obtuse when it measures 130 degrees. There's not an if or a then in there.
I'm confuzzled.
So, when it doesn't have an if or a then, the first thing you got to do is you got to break the sentence up into two pieces. An angle is referred to as obtuse when it measures 130 degrees. The two pieces in this case are going to be an angle is referred to as obtuse and it measures 130 degrees because each of those pieces kind of gives you some sort of an idea of what's going on. It's kind of a complete thought in itself. Now, which one is the if and which one is the then is whichever one makes most sense as being like, yeah, that's logical thinking. If an angle is obtuse, then it is 130 degrees. Is that necessarily true? No. If an angle is 130 degrees, then it is obtuse. Is that true?
Yes.
So that way makes more sense in this statement. And if it helps you to write it out that way,
Can I get a Band-Aid?
yes.
I must have.
If an angle measures 130 degrees, then it is obtuse.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Which would make an angle is 130 degrees the hypothesis, and it is obtuse the conclusion. Now, notice I didn't rewrite it word for word. You can paraphrase a little bit as long as you don't change the meaning of things. So, speaking of rewriting, that's another thing that we're going to have to practice doing, rewriting a sentence as an if-then sentence. Now, keep in mind, if I give you a conditional statement, I did not promise that it was a true conditional statement. But when you write a conditional statement from something, you want to make sure you write it in a manner that is true. So when we try to write something like all birds have feathers as an if-then statement, I want to make sure that what I'm writing actually makes sense. If. I know I'm going to start with if. That's a guarantee. It's an if-then sentence. This sentence is a little hard to break up into two parts. It's not obvious how it breaks up. That tends to happen when you have this situation where they're making this general statement of all things have this. That all tends to mess with things. Generally, if you want to break up a sentence like this into two parts, you're going to break it up into one part that is all of whatever item they're talking about. And then you're going to break it up into what feature that item has.
Which is birds. Oh wait, no, it's not. It's feathers.
The feature is feathers. Now, you can't write something like, if all birds then have feathers. That doesn't make sense. You have to start off in these ones that say all of something. You need to say something is one of those things.
A bird.
A bird. What type of things are birds?
Flamingo.
We want to go more general, not more specific.
Mammals.
Animals or mammals. Mammals are not birds.
What?
I heard mammals, and I almost said it.
Wasn't me.
If animal is more generalized, so we're going to say an animal is a bird. We will say something is that item. Then, all birds have feathers, which means if all birds have feathers, if an animal is a bird, then what can we say? It has feathers. They have feathers, whatever it might be. Since I just said a single animal, I'm going to say it has feathers. Now, I get asked this every single time. So before I do my underlining and my boxing, before I go any further, I am not grading your spelling. I am not looking at if everything's perfect English. I am looking at, are you getting the general idea of breaking this down? If you say something along the lines, if all birds then have feathers, I'm going to be like, no. That I'll have an issue with. But I'm not, you forget the I in animal. Okay, whatever. I'm not looking for perfection. Second half of the sentence before it moves on. Underline the hypothesis and box in the conclusion. What part's the hypothesis? An animal is a bird. Remember, the if is not technically part of it. And the conclusion? It has feathers. You are in Texas because you are in Houston.
If you are in Houston, then you are in Texas.
If.
You are in Houston.
Why did you choose to start with you are in Houston rather than you are in Texas?
Because Houston is in Texas.
But Texas is not necessarily always Houston.
Yeah.
It's about making that statement as true as possible. On this one, we want to start with you are in Houston. Because of the fact that if you're in Houston, you should be in Texas, but if you're in Texas, that doesn't mean you're in Houston. Here's another thing that can help you. You see this word because here? If you see the word because, that means the stuff that comes after it is the hypothesis. It's saying the first piece is only true because the second piece is true, which means the second piece needs to come first. So if you are in Houston,
I've been to Houston. Good for you.
not the point,
I've also been to New Mexico. And Iowa.
then you are in Texas. I already said the hypothesis piece was going to be the you are in Houston, and therefore the conclusion piece is you are in Texas. All members of a soccer team have practice today. See that word all?
If members of the soccer team.
So we're gonna, that all is gonna break up, and the all is referring to members specifically of the soccer team. That's where we're breaking it.
Can I take a wild shot at this?
And the feature is they have practice. I want to give other people a chance to think, and you already took a wild shot at the last one.
No, it wasn't a wild shot. I just knew that one.
My point is you didn't give other people a chance. So not on this one, please. Okay, if. Okay, this is another one where it kind of has that all feature, which means I need to say something fits in that all. What type of things are members of a soccer team? People. Players. Maybe you are a member of the soccer team. You're not going to say if a cat is a member of the soccer team. That'd be a little bit weird.
That actually is, I have actually made catch.
So, if, and you have to go with someone. You can literally write the word someone. I'm going to go with you because it's shorter. Are a member of the soccer team. Then, we could follow it up with, you have practice today. You are a member of the soccer team is the hypothesis, and you have practice today is the conclusion. Now when it comes to these sentences, these if-then sentences, or even ones that aren't in an if-then form, another key thing that we can do with them is known as a negation. Negation. A negation, technical definition. Its technical definition is altering the statement so that it has the opposite truth value. Truth value is essentially telling me if it's true or false. To make something being the opposite of true or false, you already know how to do it. The sky is blue. If I said the sky is blue, on a typical day, would you agree with me? How do I say a statement talking about the same thing that's false? No, I wouldn't ask a question. I would say the sky is
white.
Not blue. A negation literally adds, or if the not was already in the sentence, takes away the word not. That's all a negation really does. It adds or removes not. You don't necessarily want to change it. One of the things I heard is when I said the sky is blue, someone responded with the sky is white. The reason we don't want to do that is because that doesn't just cancel out it being blue. That says something technically different. It's saying a different statement about the sky. So we just work with the word not, adding it or removing it if it was already there. Okay, so we're going to write a negation of the following. The car is blue. The car is not blue. You prefer isn't? That also works. Contractions are fine.
That's the blue girl.
The cat is not black. The cat is black. Is the negation. We talk about these things in order to get to what's on the next page, which is our last page of notes for today. if-then statements are statements that have actually a sense of power to them when it comes to this idea of being true or being false. One of the things, put the phone away please. One of the things though that people tend to do is they assume that if you can read it one way, that you can read it the other way. Specifically, they do this a lot in mathematics. But we've already come across situations where that doesn't work. Going back to the, if you are in Houston, then you are in Texas. When we flipped that around and said, if you are in Texas, then you are in Houston, that's not always true. But if you are in Houston, then you are in Texas is. And this is an important piece because in math, people tend to assume they're both true, which causes issues. Now, taking a conditional statement,
Sorry.
we had a deal.
Yeah, I sneezed.
Taking a conditional statement and modifying it a couple of very specific ways creates a different conditional statement that sometimes will be true and sometimes will not. A conditional statement symbolically can be written as a P with an arrow to Q, which really just means if P then Q, where P and Q are just placeholders for statements, for smaller statements that you just kind of fill in to that. If we were to flip those two around, going from Q to P,
If you then P.
which is if Q then P, is what's known as a converse. For a memory trick, you'll often hear me refer to the converse as the reverse. Another way we can modify conditional statements is with the little squiggle, which that little squiggle is a negation. So if I take an original conditional statement, if P then Q, and I put the knots on both of them, it's known as the inverse. It's the one that has the knots. And the inverse would say, if not P, then not Q. That's the wordy version of those symbols. And if we do both of those things, if we flip-flop the sentence and add the knots, it's called the contrapositive. Yeah, it's the most complicated of the words. Which is how I use it as a memory trick too. The one with the most complicated name is the one that's the most complicated of what you do. Now, I didn't say it was complicated. It's just the hardest of them, but it's not necessarily hard. And it does both the flip-flop and adding the knots. It says, if not Q, then not P. So, last type of thing you're going to see today is going to ask you to write out a conditional, an inverse, a converse, and a contrapositive. And it's going to do that given what it tells you to be a P and what it tells you to be a Q. In this case, it says P is an animal, is a lion, and Q says it is a cat.
If an animal is a lion, then it is a cat.
So we're going to start with the conditional.
Do we have to write all of them?
Yes. You'll be okay. All of these start with the word if. Conditional goes from P to Q. So if an animal is a lion, so that's the if P part, then it says Q. It is a cat. That's the conditional. I also want the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. The converse was the reverse that starts at Q and goes towards P. If. Now before I write this sentence, I want to stop real quick because there is something we have to do sometimes when we flip-flop P and Q. When I have a sentence like, if an animal is a lion, then it is a cat, what is the true subject of the sentence? What are we talking about? The animal. The thing we're talking about is the animal. And the subject of a sentence technically should always go at the beginning. So when I write the converse, I should keep the words an animal because that's what we're talking about in the beginning. And the actual things that I should switch around is what I'm saying about said animal. So instead of saying, starting with an animal is a lion, I'm going to say the animal is a cat. That's what I'm flipping around. Then, it is a lion. That was conditional, that was converse. Inverse comes next, which is the one that goes squiggle P to squiggle Q. If an animal, we're still talking about the animal, so it's always going to start with if an animal for these four sentences. Not P. P says the animal was a lion. To say not P says the animal is not a lion. If an animal is not a lion. Then goes to not Q. If you add not on one side, you add not on the other. The nots always go on both. It is not a cat. Now, do you notice that I didn't say anything about if these statements were true or false? When you write out a conditional, a converse, an inverse, and a contrapositive, our focus is not if they are true or false. Can you look at if they're true or false if you want? Sure. If an animal's a cat, is it necessarily a lion? No. If an animal is not a lion, does that mean it can't be a cat? No. If an animal is a lion, does that make it a cat?
Yes.
It makes it a big cat, but it is a cat. In this case, the conditional is true, the converse is false, the inverse is false. That's not what I'm looking at. If you want to look at it, it might be interesting, but it's not our focus. Okay, last one's the contrapositive.
Can we just skip that one?
No.
Oh, I mean, can we skip B?
No. The contrapositive is the most complicated word, which means it's the most complicated. We have to do the most things. The only real things we do on these sentences is flip things around and add knots. So we just have to make sure we do both those things. If, are we still talking about an animal? So I still start with an animal. But this time I say it is not a cat. And if I add not to the beginning, I also have to add not to the end. If an animal is not a cat, then it is not a lion. I do want to do the last problem because for the most part it's been a lot of me talking and a couple of people responding back. But I want more people answering questions, so I'm going to call on people at random. Okay, let P be that a polygon is a pentagon, and let Q be that it has 5 sides. Now I'm going to ask a couple of different questions that go into these things, so don't just automatically assume what the question is. Okay, conditional statement. Galby, is this the one that goes PQ, QP, not P, not Q, not Q, not P? Like, what's the order of a conditional? It's the simple one, P, Q. Jesus, what is the subject or the item that we're talking about in this sentence? A polygon. Which means every single one of these sentences is going to start with if a polygon. Yes?
Do we have to write the P to K?
You don't have to write this. I write this out to kind of help us organize. But no, you do not have to write that. If a polygon Jalen, how should I finish my conditional statement? Not yet. I have to put Q on there yet. Yeah, I just put the beginning of it. Then it has 5 sides. I think I confused you because I just wrote it a polygon. I'm going to choose to do the one that goes from Q to P next. Lincoln, what's that one called? The converse. Eli, how does this sentence have to start?
If it has 5 sides.
Ooh, but what's the it?
The it is, I don't know.
How did the other sentence start?
If a polygon.
That's the key thing. We got to start with that. If a polygon, because that's the thing we're talking about. But you are right that we have to say it has 5 sides. So if a polygon has 5 sides. Rule of thumb, you shouldn't start a sentence with an it. Then, Jerry, what comes after the end, the then in the converse?
Pentagon?
It is a pentagon. Generally, the it needs to go in the second half of the sentence. I want to do inverse next. Can't call on people who aren't here. Vivian? The inverse. The Q's and the P version of inverse. What does that one say? Like what is this little thingy for inverse?
Squiggle P and squiggle
Squiggle
Q.
P and squiggle Q. Trevor, what the heck do those squiggles mean? No or not, yes. Okay. Nick, how must I start the sentence? If we, if what is not? Have to start with if a polygon, because we're talking about a polygon for both of these. But then, yeah, is not what? You got it. Kane, how do I finish the sentence? Not quite. Then it does not have 5 sides. Got one last one to go. This is the one that goes squiggle Q to squiggle P. Steven, what's the name of the one that goes squiggle Q to squiggle P? Contrapositive. Ella, how should I start the contrapositive? All of these have to start with if a polygon, because that is what we're talking about. Max, if a polygon, what for the contrapositive? Does not have 5 sides. No, can you finish it off for us? Then it is not a pentagon. Good. Okay, did I tell you it was going to feel more like an English class? Does it feel a little English classy? Yeah, the beginning of it does. 2-1 and 2-2 both feel a little bit like an English class, and I promise we will get back to it feeling a little more mathy soon enough. So today was 2.1, day 1. Today is the 19th. Now, I give you 2 school days. How many school days do we have before break? 1. Please do not wait until the day before the end of break to do this homework assignment. You'll probably forget. It is due on Thursday, January 2nd. It's our first day back from break. It is a book assignment. Now, I've mentioned this before. Please, when I write day 1 on the book assignment, that means we're on that page 2 days. Please write on the top of your homework assignment, page 69, day 1, including the day 1. That way I can differentiate them more easily. It is questions numbers 1 through 16. Most of these do not ask you to write the 4 sentences. If all of them ask for 4 sentences, that would be way too long of a homework assignment. Some of them just ask you to do things like identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. So, do not freak out that you have to write 4 sentences for all 16 of these. You don't. Okay, please use your work time wisely.